Jay's the best vehicle I've ever owned.
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna get started.
Yeah.
And before we actually get into the lesson today, we're at lesson number 7. I did tell you about a book last week, and I was pretty sure, it's on my shelf. It's called Left Behind. It's by Peter and Patty Lalonde. They're Canadian. This is an older book. It was written in the 90s. Okay, yep. And so
How do you
like
spell that last name?
Lalonde.
Peter
Peter and Patty, Patti. You can pick it up online for like as low as $3 plus shipping now. So it starts, right on the cover is the year 2000 approaches, and the rapture draws near, a startling new message for those who will be left behind. And the way this is written is for somebody who is left behind, and it starts off with chapter 1, a letter to the other side. Dear friend, hello, my name is Peter Lalonde. My wife Pat and I wanted to write you this letter to try to help you understand the world in which you are living. It's very and it talks about what you've experienced and what happens, and the Bible predicted this, and goes right through basically everything we're going through as if it has already happened, or is happening in the midst of
Isn't
happening.
that amazing?
Yeah. So great little
How do you
resource.
spell the last name?
Lalonde.
V-E. Okay.
DE.
D is in David.
D is in David.
Oh, V-E.
Lincoln Adam,
L-O-N-D.
Lincoln Oscar, Norm.
Lalonde.
Oh, there's another O in.
Yeah.
This is the initial Left Behind.
This
No.
is not the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye, Jerry Jenkins. That's a fiction. This is more of like a non-fiction.
This is
thing.
relative to what we've
Well, there's
spoken
an
of,
L in the
relative
L
to
and L.
Yeah.
being able to
Long
refer to
one.
people that.
Yeah, they're
maybe
Canadian.
they'll-
Correct.
Possibly from. with
So you
that.
might leave them a personal letter along with this book.
That's an interesting idea.
I
mean, we're gonna have
put
to
it in an
read.
envelope in case I disappear.
Well, we're gonna have to read this too to know what we're referring
Right,
to
sure.
these
Sure.
people too. This is
What would you give them as Christmas gifts?
Again, it's like
Stocking
you
stuff.
can get it for like $3, so it's
I
not bad.
started buying used and I'm getting semi-new books.
Mhm.
Used very good or
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I'm getting new books.
Thrift books,
I've never got
$2.95. So I mean,
I always get used good, and they're like brand new.
yeah.
Pastor carried this to study, and I looked at it quickly.
Right.
I went and bought it, and I can't say enough about this.
Oh,
I have had my nose in this. I just read Daniel. The explanation's awesome. Can't say enough. If you're at all interested, I cannot recommend this high enough.
Okay, what is it?
It's a study Bible, and if you want to look at it, sometime
Yeah,
later,
I've got
flip it
mine.
and pick a verse.
ESV.
Mine's a King James.
I don't want to steal the
Study
show. He's
Bible.
trying to get started.
Yeah.
All right. So today we are going to start talking about the tribulation period, and I didn't get very far. So actually, we're not even going to get to the first seal today.
Oh,
So what we are going to talk about is Daniel's 70 weeks. Okay. I want to talk about before we get into the details of the tribulation, why this is going to happen, how it fits into God's plan. So, back in Genesis, we have Adam and Eve who sinned in the Garden of Eden. And Genesis 3:15 says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This is the curse that God gives the serpent, Satan, for his part in the downfall of mankind. And it's known as the proto-evangelium, the pre-evangelical message, which is that God is going to send a savior, okay? And what it infers is there's this idea of this offspring or the seed, okay, which we end up seeing in covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, where he first of all promises that Abraham will be a great nation, right, which becomes Israel, and also that he's going to give them the land, this land, which was comprised mostly of Canaan. And it also talks about a physical seed, you know, which is Abraham's lineage, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. And that ultimately leads us to Jesus, right? Because Jesus, if you go to Matthew 1 and look at the genealogy, it traces it back to Abraham, okay? And there's another genealogy where it goes all the way back to Adam, but we see that. And then we have, of course, the spiritual seed. In the Bible, we have this metaphor of the olive tree, the holy olive tree, with the roots of the tree being the nation of Israel, okay? And Abraham is the taproot, and then Isaac and Jacob, and then we get the trunk of the tree, which is the nation of Israel. And then as you read through the Old Testament, we see, and I talked about this on Sunday a little bit, you know, we have this very patient, loving, merciful, and gracious God keeping his promise to a very disobedient Israel who had to be constantly disciplined. And obviously it gets to the point where Israel rejects the Messiah. But Jesus talks about being the vine, okay, and Israel being the branches, John 15:1-6. I'm the true vine. My Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, so he's giving them a warning here, and he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it might bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. And eventually, many of them, including, or in particular, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, rejected the Messiah. That the ultimate chosen seed, Jesus. And what happens is God allows other branches to be grafted into that holy tree, which is the Gentiles, right? Israel's a nation ceased to exist in 70 AD, and only a remnant scattered around the world remained. And so then we have the church age, which is what we're living in now. We are the holy olive tree. That remains. Now, eventually, as we'll see in the tribulation, God's going to start grafting the branches of Israel back into that tree again, because it's ultimately his promise. Now, there's, like my lecture professor would disagree with me on this, okay? So we'll talk about that later, but not today, but later. Does that mean, again, that God was done with Israel when they rejected him completely? Let me back that up a little bit with what Paul has to say in Romans 11. And if we can take our Bibles out, we're going to go ahead and look at that today. Romans chapter 11.
Romans 11,
Verse 1.
okay.
Why did you get the Genesis
3:15.
that you were just referring to?
Genesis 3:15, and the Abrahamic covenant is in Genesis 15.
Romans what?
11.
Verse 1.
Sure, everybody's there. Everybody there?
11.
All right. So this is Paul, and he says, I asked them, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer the basic of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see and bend their backs forever. So I asked, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, and as much then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. There, right there is a warning to the progressive church, okay?
I guess not.
Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? We could keep going there, but I think you have the idea. Again, the big picture here, God creates this earth. Essentially, heaven is on earth in the Garden of Eden. God walked in the garden daily. He creates humanity. They're on probation, so to speak. You know, they have free will, but there's a rule that they can't break. And that rule is don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they fail, and they fall. Creation falls. God has a plan, a chosen seed, a chosen people, which leads us to Jesus, who brings redemption. But there is still evil on this earth. It's not consummated yet, okay? God uses the church to spread the message of the gospel to the ends of the earth, the Great Commission. He's patient. He wants none to perish. But as I said Sunday, God is holy, holy, holy. And at some point, God will judge and put an end to this. And we know from looking at the signs that Jesus used the term birth pangs, right? And we have our seed. Then as we get closer and closer to the birth, these signs occur more frequently with more intensity, and then just before the birth, intense pain, and the baby's born. Or in our case, Jesus returns. Okay, and so we're now going to talk about the intense pain part. That's what we're going to be getting into, which is the tribulation period. And we're going to talk about the different views on the millennial kingdom after we talk about the tribulation and Christ's return. But you have to have a couple basic, at least one basic understanding. I believe I fall into the camp of premillennialism. Okay, in other words, we're living in a time that is pre or before a literal 1,000 year reign of Christ on earth. Okay, it's literal. He will come down on earth, literally be here for 1,000 years before the very end of the Bible occurs. Okay, so when you hear a premillennialist talk about the tribulation, it's a literal tribulation. Okay, and you will hear us say it's a 7-year period. Why is that? And that's what we're really going to look at today. Why do we have this 7-year period? And where do we get that from? Because there's a lot of, I don't say a lot, but the other camps would deny this. Okay? And the answer is we have to look at Daniel, Prophet Daniel. And it's found in Daniel 9. So in Daniel 9, starting in verses 20 to 23. Okay. Daniel 9, 20 to 23. I'm not going to read 20 to 23, but the angel Gabriel is talking to Daniel. Okay, the same Gabriel that came to Mary and Joseph. And he's telling him what's going to happen. Okay. And then in verses 24 to 27, this is what Gabriel tells Daniel. I'll wait for...
Which one, Daniel?
Wait,
9.
just finished it. I was looking for something else in the end times and I went to Daniel.
Yep. Daniel was rich.
And again,
20,
gave me more. I've read it
the
before.
77s.
The study Bible gave me a lot more. It's not as cryptic as I thought it was previously.
Yeah. Daniel is difficult to understand. That's why it's said at the end of it that it's to be sealed up till the time of the end, because people aren't going to really understand it.
But I got more clarity from the EVS.
Well, we
than
understand
ever
it now.
But ever,
For
than
sure.
ever before. Yep,
So
good stuff.
in 24 to 27, this is what Gabriel tells Daniel. He says, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the world to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its ends shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So God has this plan, and he says after 70 weeks, he's going to put an end to sin, atone for that sin, and bring everlasting righteousness, to bring heaven and earth together. He breaks this all down. Okay, there's a total of 70 weeks, and I'm going to put that in quotes, 70 weeks, because, and I'll talk about that in a second, but 70 weeks, and something's going to happen, okay? then for 62 weeks, and then then after 62 weeks. Why do I put weeks in quotes? Well, it's because of the translation from Hebrew to English and the context from that culture to our culture. In the original language, it's the Hebrew word Shavua, and it can mean a week, but its main meaning is 7. Okay, 7, a group of 7, or 70. J. Dwight Pentecost, one of the leading scholars on this, tells us that when Daniel hears this group of 7s, he's thinking of God's plan in terms of years, okay, not days or weeks. Because in Daniel's context, that would have been natural for him, okay? And why is that? Well, when we think of years in our context, what do we typically think of? No, we think of decades.
True.
10 years usually, right? A century,
Okay,
a millennium, a
Our number
decade,
system- our number system.
right? When we're thinking of years, okay? And Daniel and his people and his time thought in terms of 7s or heptads. God created everything in 7 periods of time, okay? There are 7 days in a week. The 7th day is a Sabbath. Every 7th year is a Sabbath year. 7 sevens brought them to the year of Jubilee. Leviticus 25, 8 to 10, you shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. Do you remember when I was doing the message on slavery? That passage was every how many years
70.
you free your slaves or your servants. And if they didn't want to be freed, they could be freed. Okay? But every 49 years, every 7 times 7 years, they would have this massive forgiveness of debt. Okay? Even if I didn't serve you as a servant for 1 day, if it happened to fall on the year of Jubilee, you would have to forgive my entire debt. Everything went back to the owners. I mean, it was a huge thing. So to Daniel, 77s would be 490 years. Okay, this period that Gabriel's telling him about. Okay, 490 years.
490.
Had Daniel meant literal days or weeks, he would have written it that way, like he did in Daniel 10, 2-3, where it says, "In those days I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meats or wine under my mouth, and I did not. Nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks." So yeah, he literally uses a different term there. In Hebrew, it's literally translated 3 sevens of days. Okay, that's how it's written in Hebrew. Also, since Israel and Judah had failed to keep the sabbatical years, every 7th year the land was to lie fallow. They broke that. Throughout her history, the Lord enforced on the land 70 Sabbaths. We see that in Leviticus 26, 34 to 35. So 490 years would be required to complete 70 sabbatical years, with one occurring every 7th year. This span of time was decreed for Daniel's people. Your people in Daniel 10, 14, 11, 14, and the holy city of Jerusalem in 9, 16, and 24. This prophecy then is concerned not with the world history or with the church, okay, but with the history of Israel and the city of Jerusalem itself. By the time these 490 years run their course, God will have completed 6 things for Israel. This is Pentecost talking. The first 3 have to do with sin. The second 3 with the kingdom. And the basis for the first three was provided in the work of Christ on the cross, but all six will be realized by Israel at the second coming of Christ. At the end of the 490 years, God will finish the transgression of Israel. The verb to finish, kala, means to bring something to an end. So Israel's sin of disobedience will be brought to an end at the end, at Christ's second coming. Okay, do we understand that? They rejected the Messiah at the first coming. Okay, they're going to go through the tribulation period, this period of suffering. By the end of that, many of them will have come to Christ, and their time of disobedience will be at an end. Okay, they'll be grafted back into the tree. We'll see she repents and turns to him as her Messiah and Savior. Then she'll be restored to the land and blessed in answer to Daniel's prayer. So Daniel's thinking in terms of years, not in weeks, okay, as it says in English. And then the revelation is given to Daniel about the inception of this important time period and its divisions, because it's broken up, okay. The 77s would begin, Gabriel said, with the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, that decree was the fourth of 4 decrees made by Persian rulers in reference to the Jews. The first was Cyrus' decree in 538 BC, which we see in 2 Chronicles 36, 22 to 23, Ezra 1, 1-4, and 5:13. The second decree was by Darius the First, 522 to 486 BC, but he made the decree in 520 BC. Ezra 6:1 and 6-12. This decree actually was a confirmation of the first decree. The third was a decree by Artaxerxes Longimanus in 457 BC, found in Ezra 7:11-26. So the first 2 decrees refer to the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The third relates to the finances for animal sacrifices at the temple. None of those say anything about the rebuilding of Jerusalem itself. Since an unwalled city was no threat to a military power, a religious temple could be rebuilt without jeopardizing the military authority of the conquering nation, the people granting permission to rebuild it. No one of these 3 decrees then was the decree that formed the beginning of the 77s. The fourth decree was also by Artaxerxes Longimanus, issued on March 5th, 444 BC, Nehemiah 2:1-8. On that occasion, Artaxerxes granted the Jews permission to rebuild Jerusalem's city walls. So that's the decree that's referred to in Daniel 9:25. Okay, that's the one that starts the ticking clock. The end or goal of the prophecy is what? It's the appearance of the anointed one, the ruler, which is who?
Christ.
Jesus. Yep. Jesus. God the Father anointed Christ with the Spirit at the time of his water baptism, Acts 10:38. But the anointing referred to here is the anointing of Christ as the ruler of his kingdom. Okay? This prophecy of the 77s then ends not with the first coming of Jesus, as some suggest, and they would be known as amillennialists. That's what my lecture professor was. But rather with the second coming of Christ and the establishment of the millennial kingdom. And this is where premillennialists like myself and amillennialists like Dr. Waltke differ. Okay. I just finished this course with him. Most of it, we didn't conflict on things. You could see little hints of it, but when we got into the one portion of the class, when we're talking about Bible prophecy, it was a stark contrast. And my professor that I interacted with every week, he's a kind of a premillennialist, but he's more of a historical premillennialist. So we still differ, but not nearly as much as, and Waltke was his professor as well.
Oh.
So he knew what I was going through. But we'll talk about what amillennialism really gets into in depth after the tribulation when we talk about the millennial kingdom itself. But this 70-year period is broken up or divided into 3 segments. We have 7 sevens or 49 years. Then we have 62 sevens, which are 434 years, and then 1 7, okay, which is verse 27. The first period of 49 years most likely refers to the time in which the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem permitted by Artaxerxes' decree was completed, 444 to 395 BC. Although Nehemiah's wall construction project took only 52 days, many years may have been needed to remove the city's debris after being desolate for so many decades, to build adequate housing, to rebuild the streets and the moat, the trench, and things like that. 9 Daniel 9:26a, the 62 sevens, the 434 years, extend up to the introduction of the Messiah to the nation of Israel. This second period concluded on the day of the triumphal entry, just before Christ was cut off, that is, crucified. In his triumphal entry, Christ, in fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9, officially presented himself to the nation of Israel as the Messiah. He rides in on a donkey, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was evidently familiar with Daniel's prophecy, obviously, God. When on that occasion, he said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your own eyes. Luke 19:42. In other words, he's saying, today could have been the day when my kingdom was completely ushered in, but because of the rejection of him, it didn't happen. So the first 2 segments of this important time period, the 7 sevens, 49 years, the 62 sevens, 434 years, ran consecutively, no time in between them. That totals 483 years, extended from March 5th, 444 BC to March 30th, AD 33. Again, we have some calendar issues here. And I have a little chart which I'm going to put online for you. That the very smart Dwight Pentecost did, or somebody did, that wasn't me. That breaks it down because it talks about the Jewish calendar years as only 360 days per year. And that brings it up to 483 years. And then you have the Gregorian calendar, which we have how many days? 365. But then we have leap years.
Yeah.
Okay. But there's other things in here. So they have this whole chart that he works it out between the 2 calendars. Okay, and I'll put that online for you. You can pass that around if you want. You have to remember when we talked about Jesus' birth, I mean, there were major issues with the calendar being switched over from the calendar the Jews used and the Romans used to what we have now, the Gregorian calendar. But what we have here is that according to Daniel 9:26, the anointed one was not cut off in the 70th seven. Okay, he was cut off after the 7 and the 62, so before the 70th seven. Okay, so we have 69 sevens. That's why you'll hear, premillennialists talk about Daniel's 70th week. What is Daniel's 70th week? It's the 7-year tribulation period. Okay, so the 7 and the 62 sevens had run their course. Now there's an interval between the 69th and the 70th sevens. Christ's crucifixion then was in that interval. Right after his triumphal entry, which concluded the 69th seven, this interval was anticipated by Christ when he prophesied the establishment of the church in Matthew 16:18. This necessitated the setting aside of the nation of Israel for a season in order that his new program for the church might be instituted. Right? Again, Israel ceased to exist with their at 70 AD until 1948. Right?
Yeah.
So Christ predicted the setting aside of the nation of Israel, Matthew 21:42 to 43. And then the present church age, that's where we are, is the interval between the 69th and the 70th seven. When the anointed one, Christ, would be cut off, Daniel was told he would have nothing. Okay, the word translated cut off is used in executing the death penalty on a criminal. The same word is used there. Thus, the prophecy clearly points to the crucifixion of Christ, or the execution of Christ. At his crucifixion, he would have nothing, in the sense that Israel had rejected him, and the kingdom could not be instituted at that time. Therefore, he did not then receive the royal glory as the king on David's throne over Israel. John referred to this when he wrote, "He came to that which was his own, throne to which he had been appointed by the Father, but his own people did not receive him." John 1:11. Daniel's prophecy then anticipated Christ's offer to himself to the nation Israel as her Messiah, the nation's rejection of him as Messiah in his crucifixion. This is where, again, amillennialists and premillennialists part. My professor would say that God's kingdom is at hand completely, that he is on the throne, and he is on the throne in heaven, right? But there are a lot of things that he would have to reconcile for this to be true, which we'll talk about as we get into the last parts of this study that he doesn't have an answer for. Okay. But the prophecy continues with a description of the judgment that would come on the generation that rejected the Messiah. Daniel 9:26. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, okay, and shall have nothing, he'll be executed. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And what happened in Jerusalem in 70 AD? That temple was completely
Razed to the
destroyed.
ground.
There was not a stone left standing, as Jesus predicted. The city which contains a sanctuary, that is Jerusalem, would be destroyed by the people of the ruler who will come. The ruler who will come is the final head of what we call the revived Roman Empire, the little horn of 7-8. That's why we kind of call it the revived Roman Empire, because who destroyed Jerusalem? Rome, right? It's significant that the people of the ruler, not the ruler himself, will destroy Jerusalem. Since he'll be the final Roman ruler, the people of that ruler must be the Romans themselves. It's a prophecy of destruction of Jerusalem about which Jesus spoke. I know that sounds a
May I
little
give you
confusing.
Could you please, you probably did this, but could you go over the abomination of desolation?
We did this last week.
Oh,
So
all right,
that's
then
the
I'll get it.
Antichrist. We'll come back to it again
Then
during
you'll-
the tribulation, because it's going to occur during that time period.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
So, in our chronological study of Jesus, we saw this. The Pharisees, okay, the leaders of the nation of Israel, registered the rejection of Christ with God by attributing his power to Beelzebub. Do you remember that?
Yes, I
Yes.
do.
Okay, the prince of demons. Matthew 12:24. Christ warned that if they persisted in that view, they would be guilty of a sin for which there would be no forgiveness. Matthew 12:31 to 32. He also warned the nation that Jerusalem would be destroyed by the Gentiles in Luke 21:24. That it would be desolate, Matthew 23:38, and that the destruction would be so complete, not one stone would be left on another, Matthew 24:2. And that was accomplished by Titus in 70 AD. When he destroyed Jerusalem, killed thousands of Jews, only a small remnant survived. But that invasion, awesome as it was, did not end the nation's sufferings. For war, Gabriel said, would continue until the end. And what do we see in the Middle East today?
Unending.
Pretty much every nation surrounding Israel wants to
Unending.
destroy Israel. I mean, they made a few peace treaties here and there, but
As history's known it, it's been kind of constant.
and even though Israel was to be set aside, she would continue to suffer until the prophecy of the 77s were completely fulfilled. Her suffering spanned the entire period from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD to Jerusalem's deliverance from Gentile dominion at the second advent of Christ. So it's not over yet.
So the Holocaust was all part
The
of it.
Holocaust is all part of it. Yeah, absolutely. And then we got to Daniel 9:27. And Gabriel unveils what will occur in the 70th 7 years. Daniel's 70th week. And he says, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. Who's the he? The Antichrist.
Yeah.
Right? This leader. For 1 week, and for half of the weeks, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. So halfway through
And
that 7 year period, after 3.5 years, he's going to put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Again, this is the abomination. This is what you were just asking about.
Isn't that the desecration of the temple?
Yeah,
And himself, he putting himself in God's place.
that's the main
Yeah.
abomination.
So we're going to see, starting next week, as the Antichrist comes on the scene, this charismatic political leader that we talked about, wooing and charming the world and getting them into a false sense of security, setting up this peace treaty. Everything's all hunky-dory for 3.5 years, besides the fact God's starting to pour his wrath down on the earth.
You get ready to come back.
Okay? But halfway through that, it's going to be like a light switch was flipped. And he's going to go from Mr. Charismatic to the worst dictator the world's ever seen. And it's all going to be.
So there'll be 3.5 years of the very bad.
Yes, we call that the Great Tribulation. Yep. And that we'll be getting into that.
But it's
next-
increased
next
negativity
couple
halfway
weeks.
through that 3.5 years.
It's going to get worse as it goes. Yeah, it's not going to be good, any of it, but
Right,
it's
but
going to
at
get
1
worse.
3/4 years, there'll be this increase in negativity until the 3.5 years and Christ comes back.
So, and we've already seen, and we'll see it again next week, the 3.5 years represented as 42 months, which is 3.5 years, Revelation 13:5. So, that is how we come up with the 7-year tribulation period. Other prophets talk about the day of the Lord in this period of time as well. They call it the day of the Lord. Prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Zephaniah, and of course Jesus talks about it. We looked at that in depth. But next week we're going to actually look at, or at least start looking at the tribulation period in detail, starting with the seal judgments. Yeah, and we'll see how far we get through that.
There's a lot of judgments.
There's a lot of judgments. There are
And that Revelation, yeah.
3 sets of 7 judgments. 3 sevens. We have a trinity. We're going to have a trinity of judgments. The seals, the trumpets, and the bowls.